The book of Hebrews was written to keep a group of Christians from falling away, from going back into Judaism. Thus, in the book of Hebrews, we find it over and over an exhortation to remain faithful, to never give up. We need the same exhortation today because there's so many Christians who give up before the end. And if they give up, then they lose everything they've worked for. Now we might ask the question, why is this true? If we really believe that God is God and there's a heaven waiting for us and a hell for those who disobey God, then why would we ever leave God? Well, that's a good question. Let's look at the scriptures, so a few verses from the book of Hebrews, and to see three reasons why men depart from God. The first reason is because of unbelief. We find this in chapter 3, verse 19, talking about the children of Israel, when it is said, "So we see they could not enter in because of unbelief." And then in chapter 4 and verse 6, we find something very similar. "Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience." Now, of course, these verses were talking about the children of Israel. You remember that they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, they were now in the wilderness. God was going to lead them to the land of Canaan, the promised land, but most all of them did not make it to the promised land. And these verses tell us two reasons. One is disobedience, and the other is this unbelief. You see, unbelief or lack of faith or trust in God is the root cause of disobedience. They both go together. If you don't really believe God, then obviously you're going to disobey God. And so the reason that Israel failed is stated to be simply unbelief. Now, it's not that they did not believe there was a God. Or they believed mentally that there was a God. God was all around them in the cloud by day and the fire by night. So they could not really deny that there was a God, but that mental assent did not translate into action. And we may fail for the very same reason. You see, there's a direct connection between real faith and obedience. Israel believed in the existence of God, but they lacked confidence in God's ability to fulfill his promises. We might wonder why. After all, they saw great signs of God's power. Not once, but for over 40 years on a daily basis, God supplied food for them. And yet they never developed an ability to walk by faith and not by sight. You see, Satan is constantly trying to destroy our confidence in God and his promises. Many people today doubt the inspiration of the scriptures. Therefore, we don't really trust them. We don't believe that we need God's help. So we try to do everything on our own. We may not believe God really means what he says. Thus, we do what God forbids, or we fail to do what God requires. We do not really trust God. Oh, we may mentally believe there is a God, but we do not really trust him. That's called unbelief. Another reason why men depart from God is found in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13. And in that verse we find these words, "But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." Here we find an exhortation to exhort one another daily. Notice he said daily. Do it today. This adds a sense of urgency and emphasizes the vital nature of exhortation. This is not something that we can put off till next year, next 5 years, 10 years, whatever. It's a sense of urgency. We need to do it today. Exhort one another. God never intended his people to be lone rangers. Notice he also said to exhort daily, not just on Sunday, Our worship together is very important. It's a good time to exhort one another, but that should not be the only time that we exhort one another. You see, it's so easy to become discouraged while following God. Virtually all the great servants of the Old Testament had their times of discouragement. They had times when they wanted to quit too. Yes, we all can get discouraged. And that's why we need the encouragement of our fellow Christians on a regular daily basis. Then the third reason why we see people depart from God is also found in the same verse. The deceitfulness of sin can seduce God's people. Notice that verse, the last part of this verse says, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. You see, sin is very deceitful. Think about the children of Israel. Here were the people of Israel. They were now free after hundreds of years of being in slavery, and yet they wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to slavery. Why would they want to do that? Well, you see, sin had caused Israel to forget the hardships of Egypt. All they remembered was that they had food to eat. They had different kinds of food. They had some meat to eat. They had other things there. They only remembered the better things of Egypt, but forgot the hard work. Sin had deceived them in forgetting what it was all about. As people often say, sin offers men what it does not give, and then gives what it did not offer. Sin offers pleasure, and is only for a short time though. It offers escape from the trials and afflictions of life, but again, it's only a very short time, and then you're back in the same world again. You see, we need to realize sin is very deceitful. But we find three reasons why men depart from God. One was unbelief. The second was a lack of daily exhortation. And the third was the deceitfulness of sin. So now let's one more question and bring it up to date. How do we keep from falling away? Well, I think that by looking at the three reasons why men fall away, we can easily apply that to our lives then. And the scripture does exactly that. In first verse we're going to look at it, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1. Those verses says, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Notice this verse said to let us fear. Now the word fear doesn't mean to be literally afraid of God, but it's a sense of caution. And notice it begins with the word therefore. The word therefore means this is a conclusion based on what has been said before. So now Christians are warned against being like Israel. So let us fear means let us notice the danger that is there. You know, when we're traveling down the road, we often see danger signs. Maybe the sign might be a sharp curve in the road, or it might be an intersection, or it might be a train crossing. You see various signs warning you what's coming up. It warns you of coming up so you can be prepared. If you follow those signs and prepared, then it's not a dangerous place at all. But if you're not prepared, then it can be a very dangerous place. So we need to acknowledge the possibility of falling from God's grace. Many continue to deny that fact. They may say that, oh, you may sin and lose God's present blessings, but you will not lose the eternal rest. It is plainly declared that we may not enter that rest in Hebrews 3 and 4. The rest here in Hebrews 4 is a reference to God's eternal rest. It's not a reference to the land of Canaan, but it's a reference to God's eternal rest. And he said, you may not enter that rest. You see, if Christians face no real danger of losing God's eternal rest, there would be no need for this word of caution. But these Christians were in danger of falling short. You see, we may fall short just like the people of Israel fell short. But then he continues on in chapter 4 and verse 11 and gives us another reason or what we can do to avoid being lost. And that is labor or to be diligent. Verse 11, it said, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest any of you fall according to the same example of disobedience. Again, he said, let us be diligent. Peter gives the same idea in 2 Peter 1 verse 10 when he said, therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. Both of these verses emphasize the fact that we need to be diligent. That means to give everything that you have, to be watchful against falling away. You see, there will be no accidental slipping into heaven, so to speak. You got to think about it. You got to work at it. This is an exhortation to work. How often do church members see a fellow member go astray without any exhortation, though? You see, we have a responsibility towards one another. When the gospel had spread to the Gentile city of Antioch, the church in Jerusalem sent Barnabas to Antioch, primarily to encourage the Christians there. They knew that these early Christians, these babes in Christ, they needed to be encouraged. And so they sent Barnabas to do that. Unbelief is a constant and dangerous temptation for a Christian. And then finally, one more thing, and that is we need to make sure that our children and our friends make a firm commitment to God. It seems to me that the Israelites never really made that firm commitment. Remember, being a Jew at that time was simply a matter of being fleshly born in a certain way or to certain parents. They were born a Jew and they grew up being a Jew. Following God then was really a matter of simply following their family, friends, and society. But when opposition developed, they had no real faith in God to sustain them. You see, we need to do the same thing. At some point, we must make a conscious and deliberate decision to serve God. Sometime we have to make a personal commitment. And yet I'm afraid for many people, it's about like the people of Israel. They're raised to what we might call Christian parents. And since they're raised to Christian parents, they always go to church. They're always raised to walk right and to do what is right. And so following God and becoming a Christian really is just a matter of doing what their family has done. It's just doing what they've always done. And then as they get older, as they face temptations, as they leave home, then what happens to their faith? Well, their faith stays at home too, because their faith stays at home with their family. That's where their faith is. It's really at home. And when they leave home, then they have no faith to sustain them. We need to be very careful, because falling away is a very real danger. It can cause you to lose your salvation, and many have lost that salvation for that very same reason. They fell away before they reached the end of the road. May you take these words of encouragement and do these things. Have a firm belief in God. Make diligence not to fall away, and make a firm commitment to serve God. If you'll do these things, you will never stumble. You will never fall away. Thank you.